Bonjour à tout le monde et bienvenue à cette conférence, la conférence de cet après-midi. Nous avons l'immense plaisir d'accueillir Klaus Welle. Klaus Welle est l'ancien secrétaire général du Parlement européen, parmi plein d'autres fonctions qu'il a occupées. Je vais y revenir dans un instant. Au sujet des élections européennes. Donc cette conférence fait partie d'un cycle de conférences sur les élections européennes que nous avons initié cette année déjà en décembre et qui va nous accompagner jusqu'à fin mai pour parler et débattre les élections européennes 2024. Ces élections européennes ont lieu dans un contexte très spécifique, comme vous savez, un pessimisme très fort vis-à-vis de la situation socio-économique du fait de l'inflation et de la stagnation de l'activité qui ont résulté de la crise énergétique, la radicalisation du débat politique sur fond de contestation des réformes en France, la montée et la normalisation du populisme et des clivages, et un risque d'érosion du soutien à l'Ukraine, envahie par la Russie de Poutine, et le retour de la violence au Proche-Orient. Et dans ce cadre de ces élections et de ce contexte de ces élections européennes, nous avons l'énorme plaisir d'accueillir aujourd'hui Klaus Welle. Klaus Welle a joué un rôle absolument extraordinaire dans les réformes du Parlement européen. Il a beaucoup travaillé sur les questions du Spitzenkandidaten ou des Spitzenkandidaten. Nous allons entendre ce qu'il en pense aujourd'hui de ce sujet. Klaus Welle, après avoir occupé le poste de chef de cabinet du président du Parlement européen, Hans-Gert Pöttering, de 2007 à 2009, a été secrétaire général du Parlement européen de 2009 à 2022. Économiste de formation, il a œuvré pour une transformation profonde de l'administration du Parlement européen, en insistant sur l'importance d'évaluation ex ante et ex post des politiques publiques. Parallèlement, il a créé en 2013, au sein du Parlement européen, The European Parliamentary Research Service. Et si vous ne le connaissez pas encore, je vous invite vraiment très très vivement de regarder très vite sur le site du Parlement européen, car ce European Parliamentary Research Service offre des analyses absolument extraordinaires sur non seulement les politiques publiques, mais la politique européenne plus générale. Klaus Welle a été chargé de la politique européenne et étrangère au niveau national, de la CDU, de 1991 à 1994. Il est conseiller pour European Horizons, un think tank transatlantique basé à Bruxelles et à la Yale University. Il est professeur invité à la LSI et à la KU Leuven. La langue de la conférence a fait objet d'échanges divers. Je laisserai Klaus Welle choisir quelle est la langue qu'il préfère. Nous sommes en tout cas ravis de vous accueillir ici aujourd'hui. Merci beaucoup d'avoir fait ce long chemin, mais vous avez été accueillis par des montagnes qui sont tout blancs, donc je trouve ça extraordinaire. Merci beaucoup et the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for this very kind invitation. So, given that this conference was announced in English and that we have at least one participant who doesn't speak French, maybe more, I think it's the fair choice to speak in English, but afterwards we can have the debate in French, as you like. You can test my French. I had only 2 years of French in this, at school, and that wasn't a major success. I had to finish it quite rapidly. But, when you're living for 30 years in Brussels, you're catching up a little bit, I would say. So, speaking about the European election, I would like to start with the following point. Many people I meet who observe Europe try to make a little shortcut and assume that it will be a little bit similar to what they know at home, their national system. It's logical, you know, if we don't have to think, we like to avoid investing too much brain power. So we think, let's assume it's a little bit similar. If you do that, you already have the guarantee to understand nothing. So what's the fundamental difference between the European Union system and the national systems? In terms of political science, the difference is that we have to differentiate between division of power systems and fusion of power systems. What's a fusion of power system? A fusion of power system is a system where you have the same majority in the government and in parliament. And if a parliament stops supporting the government, the parliament is dissolved, there are elections, and that majority is re-established. That's basically the system in most, if not all, member states of the European Union. That means you have a very, very strong closeness of the parliamentary majority and the government. The European Union system is different because it's a division of power system. So we are a little bit closer still to Montesquieu. What's a division of power system? A division of power system is a system of permanent negotiation where the government cannot take the parliament for granted. A division of power system is, for example, the system in the United States. You have the House of Representatives, you have the Senate, and you have the administration. And they're in permanent negotiation with completely open outcome. Currently they negotiate, for example, about financial aid for Ukraine. You have a majority of the Democrats in the Senate, small one. You have a very small majority of the Republicans in the House, and you have a Democrat administration. And they're negotiating with open outcome. Maybe they come to an agreement, maybe they come to no agreement. The system in the European Union is a division of power system and therefore much more similar to the United States system than to our national systems. That means everything is permanent negotiation. You have maybe one majority in the parliament, another one in the council, and then you have the commission. And when the commission is making a proposal, what should be done? Parliament can say yes, no, or maybe. Normally we say maybe. And we have 500 wishes for change. Very different to the national level. We might even say, look, we are not interested right now. We are having a look at this in a year's time, or in 2 years, or in 3 years. And no negative effect on the stability of the system. So you have 3 independent partners in that negotiation, and Parliament is independent from the executive and not submitted to the executive like in many national systems. So it's a division of power system. Therefore, one of the questions that's raised in the run-up to European elections, which is standard, which is kind of, okay, now we have elections, what kind of coalition is going to come out of these elections? You know, will there be a right-wing coalition or a left-wing coalition? That question doesn't make any sense in the European Union. We will not have a right-wing coalition, we will not have a left-wing coalition. On all issues of legislation, members of parliament have to earn the majority on every single file based on the merits of the file. So you are not automatically right because you belong to the majority, and you're not automatically wrong because you belong to a minority. You have to earn the majority on your file with arguments. And you don't know in advance who's going to support you. Sometimes the support is going to come from very strange corners. You know, you might be on the center right, and you're supported by somebody who is very much on the left, or you're on the left and somebody supporting you who is on the center right, or even on the right. You have to earn the majority on the merits of every file. And if you don't know in advance how you can get to your majority, or you fail, how you can get to your majority, what does it mean? It means you have to respect everybody. It creates a completely different culture. It creates a cooperation culture. You cannot say, I'm from the right and therefore hate the left and I don't talk to them, or I'm from the left and therefore I hate the right and I don't talk to them. They might be the ones who give you the majority to your file, and you don't know in advance, and therefore you have to cooperate. That's a very provocative idea for French people. You know, you're either on the right or you're either on the left, and you know the other ones are wrong. Not in the European Union. So if you should ever decide to work in the European Union, it will not be like in France. It's very different. So to ask the question in advance, what kind of majority will be established after the European elections, doesn't make sense, because it's regularly cooperation across the center. So that's the first systemic condition of politics in the European Union, which is very different and which doesn't allow just to assume it will be a little bit like at home, because it is not. What's the second systemic precondition in the European Union we have to understand is different? The second one for the election is that we have European Union parties. I've been the Secretary General of one for 5 years, but they are not on the ballot paper. So you have European political parties, you have European political groups in the European Parliament. They are very important. But you're not voting for them when you go for elections. You vote for national parties. So the result of the election is the addition of all the votes for the national parties that belong to the same political family. What is the consequence of this? The consequence is that European elections are decided, it's again a bit provocative, in 3 moments in time. Before the election, on election day, and after the election. Why before the election? If European political parties and parliamentary groups in the European Parliament are alliances of national parties, then it's very important which alliance you are able to build before. The strength of the political alliance you are able to build in the 5 years in the run-up to the European elections has a huge impact on the electoral outcome. I can give you 3 examples on 3, let's say, major families. For example, in the socialist group, you have the Democrats from Italy, who, by the way, don't think that they are socialist. I know Enrico Letta was their prime minister candidate. I know him for more than 30 years, and he's not a socialist. That's what he told me. They were before in the liberals. They moved to the socialist group, social democrat group. You know, it can be a little bit flexible there. But that made the socialist group much more competitive. These are 15 members, maybe 20 members, maybe in very good time, 25 members. So being able to attract them to the socialist and make them leave the liberals made a big impact. last elections, you know, Macron would not like to be called liberal, because liberal is a bad word in France. If you claim you are liberal, you are applying to receive less than 3% of the votes. The last liberal party I remember was Démocratie libérale, and they, you know, they were in this area of 3%. So he does not want to be called a liberal. He's not a liberal, but they joined the liberal group in the European Parliament. Could have gone somewhere else. It's a big party, 20 seats, makes a big difference. Now I can speak about myself. In 1994, I became the Secretary General of the European People's Party. So, Christian Democrats, some conservatives. And this was at the time with the support of Helmut Kohl, who was German Chancellor. And Helmut Kohl was very frustrated because the socialists were always winning the European elections. So, as a Christian Democrat, you know, he preferred that the Christian Democrats would be winning the elections. So my job, when I was proposed and then elected as Secretary General of the European People's Party, was to make the EPP the strongest political force in the European Union. How do you do that? Mergers and acquisitions. No, I can say this because I studied economics. Huh? So if you're in economics, you are allowed to think in terms of mergers and acquisitions. So enlarging the party to other parties who are ready to work on the same program. At the time, that was, for example, the French Gaullist, was also Forza Italia, the Nordic conservatives, PSD, they came from the liberals, and at the time also Fidesz from Viktor Orban, but at the time he was still a liberal, you know. He moved very much to the right, and his problem is that in the last 25 years he never stopped moving to the right. If he had stopped at a certain moment, maybe it would have been okay. And at the end of this process, 5 years, there were European elections, and the alliance was so strong that the EPP became for the first time the strongest political force in the European Union, and stayed it for the next 25 years. Mergers and acquisitions, but based on political program. And without that, you wouldn't have had Ursula von der Leyen Commission President, you wouldn't have had Barroso Commission President or Jean-Claude Juncker, because they could claim it because of the strength of the political family. So, given that these are alliances of national parties, the strength of the alliance you build up in the 5 years to the run-up of the European election is very important. Then, of course, election day. Election day is very important, like, fortunately, like in every election. But also after the European election, because once the election is happening, there is still 5-6 weeks to the constitutive session of Parliament. And you will have about 10% of the members who haven't yet found a European political family, because they are new. Let's take, for example, Dutch parties currently. In the Netherlands, the party political system is very much changing. And you have new parties which are very successful, like the Omtzigt Party or like BBB, just created, very successful, and they don't yet have a political home in Europe. So they have to find one. 10%. Not all of them new, some didn't find in the past. For example, 5 Stars in Italy. 5 Stars in Italy now exist for some time. They still haven't found a political home. I remember they wanted to join the Greens last time. And a discussion with the Secretary Generals of the Greens, and she said, we cannot take them because there are too many. So they would dominate the Green group. In the meantime, the 5 Stars have solved the problem. They're a little bit weaker, they are smaller, so maybe they will find a home. So, when you have a look at European elections, you have need to have a look at 3 moments in time. 5 years before the run-up, the strengths of the alliance being built. Secondly, the election. And thirdly, there is competition for some parties who could go, let's say the 5 stars, could go to the Greens. They could also go to the left group, for example. And that decision can matter if they have 15 seats. And if they find nobody, it also matters for the composition of parliament afterwards. Third point, or third pre-remark is, the Spitzenkandidat is back. So Spitzenkandidat is not a French word, but as a German, I have to insist on Spitzenkandidat, because the only other word we managed to get into international language was kindergarten. No, it's not good enough. So if we have a second chance, I have to insist. So what I'm speaking about, lead candidates. The idea that the citizens should know who should become Commission President if a political force is successful. In 2014, I had a portrait in the Financial Times, page 3, never before, never later, where they accused me to have been the devious mind behind the idea of Spitzenkandidaten. I was not the only devious mind. There were several devious minds, but I was one of the devious minds, and simply because I thought it makes sense that when people go to vote, they do not only know, okay, what should be the composition of parliament, but they should also have an idea, with this political force, who do they want to run the European executive? Because it's an additional element of choice. So if you think, I mean, the French system is different, but in most countries, the parliamentary majority decides on who is running the executive. In Germany, surely. And when people go to vote, they are not only thinking about composition of parliament, they are thinking about who should run the executive. So you need both arguments in the debate. In 2014, it worked. So there was a Spitzenkandidat, was called Jean-Claude Juncker, and in fact he became the Commission President. Why did it work? Different reasons. A, the governments thought that this idea of lead candidates was so absurd that they didn't have to worry about. So they were deeply asleep, which is the best situation you can have them, you know, when you're on the other side in parliament. I was giving a lot of presentations in Brussels on the idea of Spitzenkandidaten. It was thought to be ridiculous. I was thought to be a nutcase. Wonderful. So if you are underestimated, you know, you can go ahead. And finally, it happened. Because Parliament said, we will vote nobody else. He's won the elections, there's a parliamentary majority behind, and the heads of state and government sitting in the European Council, who were accustomed to take that decision themselves, behind closed doors, had to accept that they didn't have any choice. But there are informal preconditions for the success of this method. And the informal precondition is that in principle, both the European Parliament and the states represented in the European Council can accept that person. Because the European Union is not a parliamentary system where just Parliament decides, it's a federal union. So we are using the F word, federal. Federal because of division of power horizontally and also vertically. It's a federal union of citizens and states. And both principles, both sources of legitimacy have the same value. Citizens represented in the directly elected parliament, states represented on the council side. Only when both come together, there is a decision. So when you find a Spitzenkandidat, you better find somebody who is acceptable for both. And Jean-Claude Juncker had been hanging around in council for about 30 years. So council couldn't say, we don't know that guy, who is he? You know, strange person. He'd been the longest serving member in the European Council. So they couldn't escape. And politically, he was a Christian Democrat, but the most left-leaning Christian Democrat available. He liked to think about himself as a social Christian Democrat, or sometimes as a Christian social democrat. So it cannot be more seducing for social democrats on the other side. So the center-left couldn't say, we don't like him. They liked him. So there are informal preconditions of the success of Spitzenkandidaten, which is that if he or she is from the center-right, has to be acceptable also on the center-left. If he or she is from the center-left, has to be acceptable from the center-right. If you choose people who are not fulfilling these criteria, you will not be successful. And if it's acceptable in Parliament, has to be acceptable in the Council as well, for the states, not only for the people. So 2019, Spitzenkandidaten again was half a defeat or half a success. Why half a success? Because the lead candidate of the Socialists made it to number 2 in the coalition, in the Commission. The lead candidate of the Liberals made it to number 3 in the European Commission. And the lead candidate of the biggest party was not, Manfred Weber was not becoming Commission President, but it was a German Christian Democrat, not from Bavaria, but from Lower Saxony. I happily admit Lower Saxony is not Bavaria, and it's a different person. But still, they didn't get very far. They didn't get very far from that. So they had to accept that principle for number 2 and number 3, and politically, that the political force that was winning the elections, even from the same country, had the Commission President. So, what is going to happen 2024? I think the Spitzenkandidat is back. So, or in terms of football, it's 1-1. The Spitzenkandidat was winning the first half, 2014, maybe losing the second half, 2019. We go into prolongation. All the parties have decided to have Spitzenkandidaten. Even the Liberals, who last time didn't do, under pressure from President Macron, because he thought he would prefer to make that choice himself in the European Council with the colleagues and shouldn't be done by the European Parliament. So everybody has Spitzenkandidaten. The Greens have just nominated, the Socialists have nominated, the EPP will nominate in March, and the Liberals will also nominate in March. And for the smaller ones, it's anyhow interesting. And for everybody, why? Because personalization gives cost-free media attention. Now, when you're running a campaign, you want that somebody is speaking about it. You prefer that. If you just have a program, that's normally not happening. Media are much more interested in people. So on Jean-Claude Juncker, you could discuss, okay, maybe he likes to drink. I think he's also smoking. Does he also have others negatives? So we found out that with Spitzenkandidaten, instead of having coverage of the European elections 3-4 weeks before the elections, it started 6 months. And much more intense than anything we had known before. So we get cost-free media coverage, the same system the Greens used, at least in Germany, but elsewhere as well, when they came into existence. How did they do that, you know? You climb on a chimney and you ask television to be there. It's a bit risky, okay. But if you make it into the main news, this is cost-free media coverage. The same whale hunting, you know, Greenpeace. Whale hunting, you send a boat, you have great pictures from there, film, you make it into the main news, you get cost-free media coverage. So what the Spitzenkandidaten does is it provides you with cost-free media coverage. When we look back at participation for European elections since 1979, it always went down until 2014 when it stabilized. First time Spitzenkandidaten, and 2019 it went up 8% from 42 to 50 point something. We cannot know what will be the participation 2024, but there is an early indicator. The early indicator is if you ask citizens, how likely is it going to be that you're going to vote? Is it likely, very likely, not at all likely? The figure as such is not decisive, but the comparison to how did people respond 5 years earlier at the same moment, that's giving you an indication. And the current figure for participation in the European elections compared to 5 years earlier is 9% up. So that's the first indication that we might be positive. Of course, we don't know. We had the same phenomenon 5 years ago, and we didn't trust it. But participation was 8% up. We don't know. But it could be, because people have seen COVID, also Ukraine. Key decisions are nowadays taken at decision-making tables in Brussels. So, what about the outcome of the elections? Would be a bit strange if we would know that already. But there are nowadays, contrary to the past, sophisticated websites which give you an idea what could be the outcome if the election would be today. So where you have aggregated figures of these national parties in their political families or political groups. My experience from the past is that for the biggest political groups, the margin of error is about 15 seats. So it can be 15 seats less, 15 seats more, but it cannot be completely different. At least it hasn't been in the past. So what is the image we are getting right now? January 2024. And now I make reference to the figures you would find in Politico. It's one, the best is if you merge different websites, but they are not so far from each other, in fact. What you're finding right now is that you would have serious losses for the Greens, serious losses for the Liberals, and also some losses for the left. The losses for the Liberals and the Greens are slightly exaggerated because in 2019, because of Brexit, they had very strong results for the Liberals and the Greens in Great Britain. So it has to be made more relative. Nevertheless, compared to last time, it has to be expected that there are losses for the Liberals in France, even though Macron doesn't want to be liberal, but they belong to the group, and for the Greens and also a bit for the left. The Socialist and the EPP as the main parties more or less stable, with slight losses, but within the margin of error, and relatively strong gains on the right and on the extreme right. In the order of 20 seats, 20, maybe 30 seats each. And of course, as I said, there are always 40, 50 seats at least, where we don't know before where will they finally end up. So, question to you, what does this mean for coalition building? Right answer, there are no coalitions in the European Parliament. But there are moments where you need a qualified majority. Not many, but for example, for the election of the Commission President, it's not just a vote, you need a qualified majority. Qualified majority means the majority of the members elected to the European Parliament. And that's tough to get. So in this moment of time, you need cooperation, negotiation between different political forces, and you cannot just leave it to accident. So this decision we have right at the beginning of the legislature, after the constitutive session of Parliament, which is the first session in July. There will be a second one, normally second session in July, this time in September, where there is a vote on the proposed Commission President, and you need a qualified majority. So I've told you a bit where's the political tendency. So will there be a majority on the right? No. Will there be a majority on the left? No. So the majority will be, the minimum condition for a majority is cooperation between the socialists, the liberals, and the EPP, which means the Christian Democrats. Without this cooperation, no chance for anybody to get a qualified majority of members elected to the House, and therefore a chance to have a Commission President elected. So I would call this the enlarged center. Center right, center left, center, you can discuss. This is the enlarged center. Until 2 elections ago, cooperation among the EPP and the Socialists was enough. But they've been shrinking. The Liberals have been growing. So nowadays you need at least 3 political families to have a qualified majority. So when you calculate the new Parliament, 720 members, 361 votes needed, EPP, Socialist, Liberals, they should be about 400, maybe a little bit more, 410. So is this enough? No. Why is it not enough? Because contrary to national sceneries, where you can assume that, there's strong discipline, you have 100% of a political family voting, maybe 99 or 98 if it's really important. In the European Parliament, for the major groups, on average it's 95, but then you have already a lot of technical votes in this calculation. So for this vote, it might be less than 90. So the 3 might not be enough for the first time. In reality, already last time. So who is also likely to vote for the Commission President? Members of Parliament who belong to the same political family as the Prime Ministers who have nominated that person in the European Council. And that's who? Shocking reality is these are the members very likely of Fratelli d'Italia of Giorgia Meloni and the members of ODS in the Czech Republic. That means the likely majority to vote in the next Commission President is EPP, Socialist, Liberals, and the members of Fratelli d'Italia and ODS in the Czech Republic. Where are the Greens? The Greens will have to take a decision, because the Greens did not vote Ursula von der Leyen, even though she proposed the Green Deal. They did not vote Jean-Claude Juncker. They did not vote Barroso II. and they did not vote Barroso I. The last 4 Commission presidents were not voted by the Greens into office. So the Greens will have to take a decision. Will they vote the candidate or will they not vote the candidate? If they vote the candidate, they can also hope to have influence on content over the next 5 years. If they do not vote the candidate, their influence might be reduced. So, difficult decision to be taken. So, why do members of parliament vote a candidate? Normally, beauty is not enough. You know, there's a candidate. Let's take, just to make it simple, Ursula von der Leyen last time. Ursula von der Leyen was the candidate of the EPP. Okay. 25% of the members of the European Parliament. But you need a qualified majority. 50% plus 1 vote. Why should the other ones vote Ursula von der Leyen? They say, give me a good reason to vote for you. So, what are good reasons? Good reasons are A, program, politics. Second, persons, people. What's going to happen to our guys if you become the Commission President? And third, institutional concessions, which means rights for the European Parliament. So, the time between the nomination of the candidate and the election of that candidate in the European Parliament, a couple of weeks normally, is the time of maximum leverage of the European Parliament. That's when Parliament is at its strongest point. And you can be sure last time round, for example, the socialists surely will have told Ursula von der Leyen, okay, you want us to vote for you. We want to know what's going to happen to climate change. We want to know what's going to happen to our social agenda. We want to know what's happening to Franz Timmermans. He was our lead candidate, not you. So will you treat him nicely? What's going to be the job he's going to get, the profile? And will he have some degree of independence or not? And the liberals the same. So, program, persons, Timmermans, the liberals, Vestager, and also institutional relations. Institutional relations sounds very technical, but to make it practical, it's more or less, you can say it's the power relation between the Parliament and the Commission. The Parliament started off in the 1950s as nobody, because governments don't give rights to parliaments. Parliaments have to fight for their rights. They have to take their rights. And when a situation is positive, okay, that's the moment you can make progress. So last time round, I was, let's say, I think the first contact of Ursula von der Leyen in Brussels, Monday, 9 o'clock, and she said, okay, you know Parliament very well, do you have any advice? And I said, look, one advice I can give to you is, if you are the candidate of institutional backsliding, because you have not been a Spitzenkandidat, I don't think you will have a majority in Parliament. So you are not a Spitzenkandidat, you better compensate. And one good idea to compensate is to make a solemn commitment that if Parliament passes a legislative own initiative report with a qualified majority of its constituent members, then the Commission takes an engagement to propose that legislation, which is what she did. Which means we got, at least to a certain degree, a right of initiative, legislative initiative, outside the treaty framework. When I left, there were 17 demands from Parliament, and at least the Commission claimed that on 16 they were on track. followed this in detail, but I think more or less they did it. So what you should be observing when you're looking forward to next time is what is going to happen on program, what is going to happen on people, and what is going to happen in institutional relations. And where can you see it? A part of it you can see in the speech the candidate is giving in front of plenary. Because directly before the vote on the Commission President, she has to give a speech. And the other political groups are sitting there and they have their list. We were asking the following things: does she promise us or not? They make their list, they tick them off, then they go back into group meetings and they said, okay, was she okay or wasn't she okay? If she was okay, okay, we can vote for her. That's what's happening this year in summer, because you have to go from 25% to 50% plus one vote on program, on people, and on institutional rights. So, as I said in the beginning, what we expect for the elections is a strengthening of the political spectrum on the right and on the extreme right. This is a process which started in 2009, continued in 2014, continued in 2019, and will continue into 2024. And of course, there are many also scientists who are dealing with the question, why is it like this? I'm not a scientist, but you can see that it is in parallel to a series of crises. Financial crisis 2009, uncontrolled migration 2015, COVID, Ukraine. Don't know whether it's the whole story. Changing media landscape might be as well, but we see a changing political system. And that space to the right of the EPP can grow next time to about 30% of the seats, which is important. So the question is, who is right and who is extreme right? And do we have any criteria to judge this? What we have normally in our national context in Germany, for example, is the question, okay, are you allowed or are you forbidden under the constitution? There are parties on the extreme right in Germany which are forbidden. The NPD, extreme right, is forbidden under the constitution. So here we are discussing about parties which are allowed in their national context to compete. And that's why they can run for the European elections. So what can then help us to establish as a criteria to say who is extreme and who is maybe not what we share as a political opinion, but who is not extreme in a more abstract sense of the word? So, of course, that can be debated, but my proposal would be that every system, and therefore you will see this is a more or less neutral, hopefully relatively neutral proposition, every system regards those as extreme who go against the system itself. From the point of view of every system, those who are fighting the system are extreme. So that's not yet a value judgment, that's, I think, a description. So the question is, what is the essence of the system in the European Union? And there we are in the area of things which are, of course, debatable. I would argue for three elements. The first is that you at least have a general readiness to constructively engage in debate and negotiation for European integration. That doesn't mean you have to be a federalist, you don't have to, but you should have that readiness to find common solutions. If you do not have that readiness, it means it's very likely that you oppose the system as such. A second system, so I'm already the third time now shocking in France, but nobody of you had a heart attack, so I dare, no. The second, which may be shocking in France, is I think that a precondition for the stability on our continent since 70 years has been transatlantic cooperation. The thought experiment we can make is we think away for a moment transatlantic cooperation. So we say, okay, NATO wouldn't exist, transatlantic cooperation wouldn't exist. This would be a very different continent, and not only in times of Russian aggression. And the third thing is more traditional, which is parliamentary democracy, pluralism, rule of law. If you apply this, you can start to differentiate both on the very right and on the very left parties which are anti-system and parties which are right or left but not necessarily anti-system. So that means parties like Vlaams Belang, parties like Wilders, they are definitely on the extreme side, proposing, for example, that the Netherlands should leave. AfD in Germany definitely on the extreme side. I also personally have a clear view about France, but I let you draw your own conclusions. But it means there are parties on the right which are not extreme right, but are on the right, because they are not fighting European integration as such. They are ready for compromise. They're in favor of transatlantic cooperation, and they don't endanger parliamentary democracy, even though they have a difficult background, like, for example, the party of Madame Meloni in Italy. The same you can say on the left. For example, Sinn Féin in Ireland is moderating its views. We all know that they have a background from IRA terrorism, which is not a small thing. But they are moderating their views. They've started to become constructive because they understand there's no future for Northern Ireland without a European Union context. And they prepare to take over government both in Ireland and in Northern Ireland. And in both, they are now the strongest party. You can say the same for Mr. Tsipras' party in Greece, who decided in July 2015 to do the necessary efforts to be able to stay in the European Union, which was very, very difficult for the party given where they were coming from. So the stability of the system is dependent on efforts to moderate, and therefore efforts of moderation should be welcome and rewarded and not rejected. So, which policy conditions do we have to expect from this outcome? I would like to mention 3 or 4. First is that this political shift inside the European Parliament will create a closer relationship or more possibilities between the Council and the European Parliament to address migration issues. The traditional majority in the European Parliament on migration issues was a center-left majority, and the traditional majority in the Council was a majority of the center-right. These didn't match, which is why we didn't have important legislation on this until very recently. By the way, interestingly, the same day in France, in the European Union, and in Germany. Secondly, the Green Deal will go into the second phase in the next legislature. I do not expect the targets to be questioned, but issues will be raised. How can sustainability be made in a sustainable way? Because also sustainability needs to be done in a sustainable way. That means there are social effects which have to be taken care of. And we don't want, at least I wouldn't recommend, that this becomes a growth program for the extreme right. In Germany, during the debate of the so-called heating law, the voting share of the AfD, which I regard as extreme right, has more or less doubled to above 20%. So the next legislature will be about not questioning the Green Deal, not questioning the targets, But how do we do it in a way that this is socially acceptable and that this is politically accepted as well? The third major issue I expect is geopolitics or even defense. That would be a talk in itself. But we are now in a completely different situation on the European continent. We basically have the west and the center of the European continent structured by the principles of the European Union, which means rule of law, negotiation, compromise. And the east, we get a new proposal from Russia, which is the reintroduction of the idea of empire. Now, empire is never very popular with the neighbors, because it means submission, violence, use of military force, and the rule of the stronger. And in between the two, you have the zone of war. That's Ukraine, but you have in danger Moldova, and you could have easily in danger also the Balkan countries. At the same time, we have a situation in Asia where you have a conflict structure which is very similar to the conflict structure in Europe before the First World War. You have an up-and-coming industrializing power, China, started a major fleet building program. Those of you who are interested in history feel reminded of the German Kaiser. And you have the established industrial power, the United States, which feels its dominance on the sea, especially in the Pacific, threatened. Historical example was Britain, who had exactly the same feeling. I'm not saying it has the same outcome, but you can see basically every week tensions because boats are nearly colliding, airplanes are nearly colliding. So we have a highly explosive situation in Asia, and we have a hot war in Europe. And at the same time, it could be that we get a second mandate for President Trump in the United States, who can put question marks behind NATO. So this will put the European Union in a very dangerous situation and all of our member states. And therefore, I expect that there will be a lot of focus also on defense. So I think I've been speaking at least 45 minutes, maybe a little bit more, but I didn't see anybody who fell asleep. So for my own justification, thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation and for all the elements that you just mentioned and the question marks that you have raised. Maintenant, on va passer en français, comme on l'avait décidé ensemble. Je vous donne tout de suite la parole. Je ne sais pas qui veut poser la première question. Je pense qu'il y a beaucoup de choses. Voilà, je dois parler plus près. Il y a beaucoup de choses que nous pouvons interroger. Il y a beaucoup de questions qui se posent. Qui veut se lancer? Je vais distribuer le micro. Alors. Je vous laisse le temps pour réfléchir et je pose la première question. Je monopolise la parole. La présentation du système européen était magistrale. La question qu'on se pose, bien évidemment, c'est que en fait, il y a deux grandes questions qui se posent. La première, c'est de savoir si tout est rapport de force. Quel est le rôle du programme politique les programmes politiques qui sont présentés au niveau national, avec lesquels, en fait, on essaie de convaincre les électeurs de voter. Donc, quel est le rôle du programme politique dans les affaires européennes? On a l'impression qu'elles sont très très loin. Et donc la deuxième question, bien évidemment, c'est que Ursula von der Leyen a été considérée en France et dans d'autres pays de l'Union européenne, mais en particulier en France, comme quelqu'un qui a joué un rôle très important pour la défense de l'Union européenne vis-à-vis la Chine, vis-à-vis la Russie, a été considéré comme quelqu'un qui était la bâtisseuse de la politique du pacte vert. Tout ça semble pas jouer, pas influencer en fait la réflexion actuelle au niveau de l'Union européenne. Est-ce que c'est quelque chose où on peut se dire le président ou la présidente de la Commission européenne en fait ne sera jamais jugé sur les résultats, mais plutôt sur ces 3 P dont vous avez parlé, c'est-à-dire programme, personnel et institution. Voilà, et je m'arrête là et je vous laisse la parole.
Yes, merci beaucoup. Donc, je commence avec la dernière question. Est-ce que le bilan de 5 ans, est-ce que ça compte quand on se représente? Et la réponse est oui, absolument. Je crois elle s'est créée une crédibilité aussi au centre-gauche. Et j'ai dit avant que pour moi, c'est une précondition de succès. Si on est un candidat au centre-droite, il faut avoir une crédibilité au centre-gauche. Elle s'est créée une crédibilité au centre-gauche. Ça, c'est sûrement le cas pour le Green Deal. Mais aussi pour tous ceux, et ça, c'est pas une question de clivage, qui pensent qu'à un moment où les grands États, où les gouvernements, et j'oserais dire en Allemagne et en France, n'étaient pas très clairs dans leur réaction et pas très vite concernant l'agression russe, la réaction était là par Ursula von der Leyen. Et on avait le premier paquet de sanctions 2 jours après. Et elle était extrêmement claire. Et je peux aussi dire en défense de ma propre institution, la première présidente à Kiev était la présidente du Parlement européen, Roberta Metsola. On était le premier Parlement globalement qui avait invité Zelensky d'adresser le Parlement européen après 1 semaine. Et après, c'était repris par le Congrès américain et les autres. Et aussi, en tant que secrétaire général, j'ai organisé voilà, une solidarité avec la Rada ukrainienne pour qu'elle pourrait continuer à fonctionner avec des matériaux IT. On fait tout. Ils nous ont renvoyé régulièrement des listes, est-ce qu'ils avaient besoin, et on a fait notre mieux de le faire. C'est vrai aussi que ça a eu des effets aussi au centre droit. Donc, des interrogations. Est-ce que, par exemple, sur le Green Deal, est-ce qu'on reste compétitif ou est-ce qu'on ne reste pas suffisamment compétitif? Et est-ce que ça crée aussi des conditions pour une croissance trop forte pour l'extrême droite? Donc, ça sont des questions qui sont posées et auxquelles elle doit répondre. La deuxième question était sur le programme. Qu'est-ce que est l'importance du programme? La cohésion des partis politiques européens ne dépend pas nécessairement de leur nom, mais mais s'ils sont prêts à accepter un programme conjoint. Par exemple, si on parle des noms, à gauche, disons, on divise quand même entre sociaux-démocrates, socialistes et parti des travailleurs. Peut-être pour ceux qui ne sont pas dedans, ce sont des petitesses, mais à l'intérieur, c'est important. Au centre droit, on fait la différence entre démocrates chrétiens, conservateurs et peut-être libéral conservateurs. Si on voit de l'extérieur, c'est peut-être une petitesse, mais à l'intérieur, c'est important. Mais donc, qu'est-ce qu'ils unifient tous ces partis qui ont une histoire très différente quelquefois, des expériences historiques très différentes? Ils doivent s'accorder sur un programme. Qu'est-ce qu'ils veulent faire? Et ce programme a différents degrés de détail. Maintenant, il y a les programmes qu'ils passent lors de leur congrès pour les grandes directions. Donc, par exemple, ces jours-là, les Verts ont passé leur programme. Ils ont dit, si Madame von der Leyen veut notre soutien, ici, nos idées. Voilà. Et nous, on va juger sur base de nos idées. Très bien. Donc, ça, c'est ce qu'il fait. Mais il y a une deuxième phase programme, parce que ça, c'est assez général. Il y a les négociations avec la présidente de la Commission européenne, et là, les partis doivent dire, voilà, ça sont nos essentiels, et sont les essentiels, les 2-3 points qu'on prend, bien que vous devez aussi faire d'autres choses. Sans ces 2-3 points, on ne va pas vous voter. Et là, on est quelquefois aussi dans une sphère plus technique, parce que si on reste dans le général, on a après l'appareil de la Commission européenne qui fait ce qu'ils veulent. Donc, il faut être suffisamment précise pour dire c'est ce qu'on veut. Donc, programme, très important, mais il faut aussi, pour avoir du pouvoir, il faut aussi avoir les chiffres des députés.
Très bien.
Alors moi, j'avais une question un peu plus pratique. Quel parcours vous avez suivi pour être secrétaire général du Parlement européen et qu'est-ce qui vous a le plus aidé, vous pensez, pour accéder à ce poste? Le plus aidé.
Oui, le Parlement là est un peu spécial parce que au moins les 3 derniers secrétaires généraux, donc moi et mes 2 prédécesseurs, avaient un background très politique. Donc moi, je suis démocrate chrétien, mon prédécesseur était conservateur et celui-ci avant était socialiste. Donc pourquoi est-ce que le Parlement fait ce type de choix? Je me pose aussi la question. Je crois qu'elle fait ce type de choix parce que le Parlement était toujours en position de faiblesse. Les gouvernements avaient tout le pouvoir. Donc, on ne peut pas se permettre d'avoir une administration qui ne comprend pas la politique, qui est juste là pour exécuter. On peut exécuter si on est content avec le status quo. Mais le Parlement n'a jamais pu être content avec le status quo. Il faut toujours travailler et se battre pour avoir plus. Donc, dans mon cas, je me suis engagé jeune dans la jeunesse catholique, rurale, après dans la jeunesse démocrate chrétienne en Allemagne. Et voilà, j'ai travaillé à l'office central de la CDU et Wilfried Martens m'avait demandé d'écrire le chapitre sur la défense européenne. Donc je l'ai fait avec le soutien du chancelier Kohl. Il a aimé ça, donc il a dit voilà, vous devriez être le secrétaire général adjoint. Secrétaire général, candidat, était Enrico Letta, qui est devenu Premier ministre italien après, et qui dans le temps était le président d'une organisation de la jeunesse, et moi j'étais le président de l'autre. Voilà, donc le jeune était demandé, et voilà, après ça, j'étais président secrétaire général du groupe, et je suis entré dans l'administration. Mais à l'administration du Parlement, on ne demande pas que les gens ne pensent pas politique, mais on pense équilibre. Équilibre entre différentes formations politiques, droite, gauche, parce que le pire pour les parlementaires, c'est s'ils doivent travailler avec les gens qui ne comprennent pas la politique, qui sont bureaucrates, dans le pire du sens. Voilà. Est-ce que j'ai oublié une autre question?
Alors bonjour, merci de vos présences déjà pour commencer. Alors vous parlez de l'importance de la relation transatlantique pour l'Europe, avant et bien sûr toujours après le début de la guerre en Ukraine. Comment pensez-vous qu'une réélection de Donald Trump influera sur la politique de l'Union européenne, avec votre expérience de la période 2016-2020? Et question qui en découle, pensez-vous que cette relation resterait importante, ou ne nous pousserait-elle pas vers plus d'autonomie stratégique en matière de défense, par exemple? Merci beaucoup.
Je crois le drame dans la relation transatlantique aujourd'hui, c'est qu'on dépend des résultats des élections présidentielles en États-Unis. Donc, on a une chance de 50%, ça peut être bien, ça peut être mauvais, mais objectivement, Donald Trump représente un risque majeur pour cette relation. Donc il y a toutes sortes de raisons pour soutenir cette idée d'une autonomie stratégique de l'Europe. Il y a la menace de la Russie. J'oserais ajouter, il y a aussi la menace de la Chine, parce que moi, je n'aimerais pas vivre sur un système qui est autoritaire ou totalitaire comme représenté par les deux. Mais il y a aussi le soutien américain qui est devenu plus douteux. Mais là, il faut donc réfléchir jusqu'au fin. Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire aussi dans la défense? Est-ce qu'on est prêt à nous défendre? Si on n'est pas prêt à nous défendre, ça aura des conséquences. On ne peut plus assumer automatiquement que c'est fait par les Américains. OK, il faut le faire nous-mêmes. Mais ça a des conséquences. Ça a des conséquences budgétaires, ça a des conséquences sur l'armée, sur la défense. Ça a des conséquences aussi sur notre capacité de manœuvrer les crises. On voit maintenant dans un monde où les Américains sont moins présents, il y a quand même des gens qui osent de créer des crises. On voit les Houthis, par exemple. Il y a 12% du commerce mondial qui, normalement, passe par là. Actuellement, très difficile. Donc, la présence américaine a aussi donné des garanties pour le libre-échange, aussi pour notre manière de vivre, qui peut-être n'est plus automatiquement là pendant les prochaines 30 ans. Donc, si nous, on veut le faire, ça demande des investissements, des décisions. Donc, c'est pas quelque chose de très facile. Mais moi, je suis pour.
I thought it was a very interesting point that you said that because of the Ukraine crisis and because of the pandemic, there might be more people voting because it's more clear how big, how many decisions are taken on European level. Do you think there will be other consequences because of these crises in the outcome of the elections?
Yeah.
Oh, and I have another question. You mentioned that the BBB hasn't found a family yet in there, and now we recently had the farmers' protest. Might it be that other national parties that have a similar program to the BBB might come up and they form a family together in the European Parliament?
Personally, I don't think so. I think they would fit either into the EPP or the ECR group, both the BBB and the Omtzigt Party. Omtzigt Party probably even more likely rather in the EPP, but there haven't been any formal decisions. But that remains to be seen. But Mr. Omtzigt came from the CDA and he just left, I think, in 2021 after he lost the leadership contest. So he has a very clear background and political education here. But things remain to be seen, and there might also be consequences of government formation in the Netherlands, which then can lead to question marks. So that remains to be seen. So the consequences of crisis. I mean, traditionally, the division of labor between European Union and the member states was that, you know, the issues which inflame people the most were left on the national level, like taxation, social security, peace and war. That doesn't mean that the decisions on the European Union level were unimportant. They were structurally important over a long time, over several years. They had important consequences. But I think what happened over the last years was that issues which were of major concerns for citizens suddenly could not be solved on the national level anymore. The financial crisis could not be solved on the national level. It's clear that if you want to have open borders inside the European Union, then you cannot solve it nationally. You have to have a common border policy for the European Union. COVID, the member states tried for 6 weeks to solve it nationally, by export restrictions, for example, or saying, look, we take the vaccines just for ourselves and we will not give it to our neighbors. 6 weeks, it was finished. And then they said, okay, we have to accept it has to be managed by the European Union, the vaccines together, and then divided among everybody. Also smaller and weaker member states, not just the big member states. And Ukraine is very evident that you can only do it together. So suddenly, issues which stir emotions, which are regarded as very important, have arrived on the European Union level. And you were asking, does this have other consequences? I think the consequences it has is that in crisis, the European Union acquires executive capacity. Or to make it precise, financial crisis, suddenly a fund of hundreds of billions to manage this kind of crisis. Or the European Central Bank developing monetary policy in a very different way as was originally the Bundesbank model. Uncontrolled migration from Syria, a European Coast and Border Guard. Complementary to the nation states, not replacing, but a European Coast and Border Guard, a kind of central facility. COVID, the capacity to manage the vaccination purchase centrally. And now we see that with Ukraine even buying weapons with the European Peace Facility, coordinating sanctions packages, I mean, in an intensity that was never heard of it, done on the European Union level. So my thesis is that in crisis, the European Union complements its legislative and regulatory capacity by complementary executive capacity, because the nation states have come to their limits in those areas.
Est-ce que vous pensez que le système du Spitzenkandidat, c'est un premier pas vers un système de liste pan-européenne où chaque citoyen voterait pour une liste plutôt européenne et pas juste une liste nationale? Et est-ce que vous pensez qu'un tel système serait bénéfique pour la démocratie européenne?
Yeah. I'm more skeptical on the transnational list than on the Spitzenkandidaten. Why? Because for this you need the approval of the member states. And you need a change of European electoral law. And it's clear that at least 2/3 of the member states don't want this. So institutional progress is very often happening by, in an anarchical way. You have to find a way to do it without having to ask for yes. And Spitzenkandidat is something that was done without first asking unanimity among the member states, because you would have never gotten it. And that's also something to bear in mind when we think of treaty change, because we believe, treaty change, that's the moment. My feeling is that treaty change, to simplify it, half of it is codifying existing practice. And the other half of the treaty change, member states have no intention to apply them. It's a bit radical, but maintenant je suis en anglais. Okay, I should speak in French maybe. So, donc il y a des changements, des habitudes qui sont là, et quand ils sont déjà pratiqués, c'est très facile de le mettre en loi. Pour vous donner un exemple, si vous regardez dans les traités, vous allez apprendre, voilà, il y a la première lecture, la deuxième lecture et après la conciliation, disons la troisième lecture. Dans la réalité des choses, 95% plus, il y a une seule lecture. Donc peut-être un jour on va dire, quand on fait les nouvelles traités, pourquoi est-ce qu'il faut une deuxième lecture, une troisième? Dans la réalité, 95-98% on fait une seule lecture. Ça, c'est un cas de codification. Donc, Spitzenkandidat, c'est une autre pratique. Peut-être un jour, ça sera codifié. Mais les listes communes, on ne peut pas, parce que là, les États membres ne le font pas. Donc, quand on pense constitution, il faut, disons, quand on est heureux, on n'est pas juriste. Parce que, parce que si on est juriste, on pense texte. Mais en réalité, une constitution consiste d'un texte, d'une pratique et de jugement du Cour suprême. Et quand vous regardez, par exemple, les États-Unis, ils travaillent en principe avec le même texte pendant plus que 200 ans. Très peu de changements. Et au XVIIIe siècle, ils étaient un petit assemblage de colonies sans importance au niveau mondial. Et la Constitution a été faite pour avoir un président le plus faible possible parce qu'ils ne voulaient pas un roi. Et plus ou moins avec le même texte, ils ont développé quand même la présidence impériale dite pendant la guerre froide. Ça veut dire quand on pense constitution, il faut toujours penser ensemble. Constitution, texte, pratique et le jugement. Et quand on veut changer la constitution globale, il faut aussi réfléchir comment est-ce qu'on peut changer la pratique. Et si on pense comme ça, on peut penser Spitzenkandidaten. Ils ne sont pas dans le texte, mais on n'a pas besoin. Et je peux dire une autre chose, j'ai toujours proposé à nos présidents de faire après l'élection de la commission, du collège de la commission au Parlement européen, une apparence publique derrière le Parlement, à l'esplanade, en invitant les citoyens. C'est pas dans le traité. Mais si on le fait, on montre à tous les citoyens que la Commission reçoit son mandat du Parlement européen. Et ça change la donne entre les institutions. Ça veut dire, si on veut changer et si on est dans la position... je peux peut-être encore ajouter un autre exemple, juste pour dire comment la manière de réfléchir est importante. Bien sûr, vous avez le texte avec toutes les institutions et les descriptions. Mais on peut rationaliser ça d'une manière très différente. Et la manière comment on rationalise ça a des importances. Par exemple, moi je dis, le Parlement, c'est la chambre des citoyens, le Conseil, c'est la chambre des États. J'ai dit ça toujours après 2009. Et après, finalement, les ambassadeurs se sont ralliés à cette opinion-là. Mais ça peut avoir des conséquences. Parce que si le Conseil est la chambre d'État, donc une chambre législative, on peut demander, OK, ils légifèrent, qu'est-ce qui seront les conditions minimales de qualité qu'on peut demander d'une chambre? Et est-ce que le Conseil remplit ça ou elle ne remplit pas ça? Est-ce qu'ils sont transparents? Est-ce qu'ils se rencontrent en plénière? Quelles responsabilités est-ce qu'ils prennent devant leur Parlement national? Donc, c'est ce que je veux dire. Il ne faut pas trop se fixer au texte. Parce que si on se fixe trop au texte, on se met dans les mains des juristes. Et les juristes, par nature, ne veulent pas de changement. Si on a besoin de changement, il faut penser différemment et il faut créer des faits dans l'action.
Thank you very much for such an interesting presentation. And I have sort of two-part question. Part number one, from your observations of many elections, what is your prediction how young people in Europe will vote this time? Is it going to be more of young people, if more of them will vote for the right spectrum of the political continuum? And the second question, potentially linked or potentially different, you mentioned that this move to the right is linked to crises, but you did mention word media. And so my question is, how is the imagination of young people, do you think, is impacted by the use of social media by the parties? And specifically, do you think that this move to the right is also due to different political campaigns put forward by the right? Yeah.
Je crois que c'est important, disons, tout ce processus de... Yes, in English, yes, exactly. Would have been a nice way to escape your question, no? Look, I think this, the change in the media landscape is very important because it gives media power into hands where it wasn't before. People who have a lot of money or other people, you know, interest groups. And that has a consequence. I mean, as a German, I've been learning in school that one of the reasons why the Weimar Republic ended how it ended was private media power in the hands of somebody called Hugenberg. And, you know, he used it to strengthen what became the extreme right. And then, to a certain extent, contributed to the Nazi party. So, to give media power into private hands and rich parties, rich people's hands, it does not come without consequences. And we see, you know, look in the United States, Twitter is now X, and okay, that's now we have the privilege to follow what Mr. Musk is thinking, and a lot of money behind this. So it's not without consequences if the states sheds this monopoly, or when you're a rich man and you can buy a controlling stake in Le Monde. Peut-être it's no longer the same Le Monde. You think it's Le Monde, but maybe it's something else. You don't know. So I think media has a consequence. Concerning voting behavior of young was always lower than for the other ones, but last time had a major increase. And the campaign of the European Parliament last time, and I'm sure this time, was especially directed for young people. So our key target group, people to go to vote, were young people, and I hope that young people will be going to vote and express themselves, because the future we are deciding on, they have to live the longest time in that future.
Merci. Alors, merci beaucoup pour cette présentation. Quel regard portez-vous en tant qu'ancien secrétaire général du PPE sur les évolutions récentes des Républicains en France ces dernières années, avec l'idée finalement qu'on pourrait déroger un peu aux traités européens, que ce serait pas très grave, et aussi qu'il fallait peut-être un peu reprendre le contrôle des frontières, notamment nationales, ce qui rappelle un peu le take back control de Farage au Royaume-Uni. Est-ce que c'est un cas individuel ou est-ce que dans toute l'Europe, il y a ce changement un peu sémantique, idéologique sur la vision de l'Europe?
Je ne suis pas sûr que j'ai tout compris, mais c'est ce que je peux dire que, disons, le phénomène Macron a détruit les structures traditionnelles en France, le centre droit, le centre gauche. C'est aussi vrai qu'ils se sont autodétruits. C'était pas seulement sa responsabilité, ils ont quand même contribué. Mais ça a des conséquences. Ça veut dire qu'il y a des structures qui sont beaucoup plus faibles restent au centre droit et des structures beaucoup plus faibles restent à gauche. Et la structuration du débat politique est maintenant avec les extrêmes à gauche et l'extrême à droite. Donné le fait qu'il est très rare que la même force politique gouverne pour toujours, un tel système a comme conséquence que les extrêmes ont quand même une beaucoup meilleure chance maintenant de gouverner la France, parce qu'on a une autre structure de la compétition. Il y a quand même un élément qu'il faut prendre en considération. En France, c'est pas le parti qui crée les candidats présidentiels, mais c'est normalement les candidats présidentiels qui se créent des partis. C'était pas seulement vrai pour Macron, c'était aussi le cas pour Jacques Chirac, par exemple. Ok, c'était un peu dans la continuité, mais on a cette habitude-là. Et donc, on ne sait pas en réalité qui seront les partis et qu'est-ce qui sera la structure de la compétition pour les prochaines élections présidentielles en France. Peut-être ça sera le même, peut-être ça va changer, c'est pas clair. Ça dépend aussi comment, au sein de la majorité, qui n'est pas une majorité actuelle, ils vont résoudre leur conflit à long terme. Et voilà, avec la dernière restructuration du gouvernement, on a vu qu'ils ont un peu bougé, mais on ne connaît pas encore la structure de la compétition politique pour les prochaines élections présidentielles en France.
C'est bon, ouais. Alors moi, ma question porterait plus sur l'avenir de l'Europe par rapport à l'opposition que Viktor Orban met ces derniers temps, notamment vis-à-vis de la guerre en Ukraine. On a vu que l'aide que l'Europe visait à envoyer en Ukraine a été souvent bloquée. Donc quel est votre avis sur l'évolution que l'Europe va porter sur cette opposition contre Viktor Orban?
Je crois on voit principalement comment on s'affaiblit si on veut décider à l'unanimité. Quand on veut décider à l'unanimité, parce qu'on pense que nous, on pourrait être mis en minorité, quand on veut décider à l'unanimité, on donne la possibilité à un seul ou une seule de bloquer tout le monde. Et peut-être cette personne est liée à des ennemis, à des régimes autoritaires à l'extérieur, à la Russie, à la Chine. Et donc, c'est un élément majeur de faiblesse. Donc, il faut aller au-delà. Encore une fois, il y a plusieurs manières d'aller au-delà. On peut changer le traité, mais aussi, on peut se créer aussi une structure plus ad hoc pour réagir. Mon expérience depuis 2009, depuis le traité de Lisbonne, c'est que quand il y a un problème vraiment grave, si nécessaire, il y a des structures ou des réponses ad hoc qui seront créées. Une coopération, un traité spécial. Donc, je crois la volonté de se laisser bloquer par un seul n'est plus très développée. Et en effet, je crois c'est ça pourquoi Viktor Orban a finalement accepté de ne plus bloquer, parce que c'était clair, s'il avait essayé de bloquer encore une fois, les autres auraient construit quelque chose à 26. Et aussi dans la politique étrangère, sécurité et défense, on pourrait s'imaginer aussi que si on est vraiment confronté à des blocages, on pourrait s'imaginer, par exemple, un Conseil européen de la sécurité et de la défense créé entre ceux qui veulent. Donc, je crois que ce pouvoir de blocage n'est pas absolu.
Oui, alors ma question, à votre avis, quelles seront les conséquences de la montée de l'extrême droite au sein du Parlement européen, à la fois pour les politiques qui vont être prises dans l'Union européenne, mais aussi par rapport à la manière dont l'Union européenne va être perçue par ses partenaires?
Je crois que ça dépend beaucoup comment on traite cette partie de l'hémicycle. Moi, je suis en faveur de faire une différenciation très claire entre une droite, qui peut être pas nous, et l'extrême droite. Parce que si on dit, et ça se dit très facilement, que tout le monde est extrême droite, donc là, tout le monde est extrême droite. Là, on aura 30% d'extrême droite. Et là, ça devient très difficile à manœuvrer. Si en plus on ajoute que peut-être on a aussi une certaine partie de l'extrême gauche qui aussi n'est pas coopérative. Et là, on va vers des blocages. Et c'est pour cela que j'ai introduit cette différence qui est extrême et qui n'est pas extrême. Ceux qui ne sont pas ouverts à trouver des solutions par principe et qui sont des amis de Vladimir Poutine et qui veulent détruire la démocratie ou le droit de l'homme ou le pluralisme, ça c'est l'extrême droite. Mais il y a aussi une droite qui est coopérative, qui soutient l'Ukraine et qui ne met pas en danger la démocratie, les droits de l'homme et les droits des minorités. Et avec cette droite, il faut coopérer. Il ne faut pas les rejeter. Mais la même chose à gauche. Et j'ai essayé d'expliquer ça à l'exemple de Sinn Féin. Si on regarde juste l'histoire ou le passé, il y a beaucoup de raisons pour dire qu'on ne pourrait jamais coopérer avec eux parce qu'ils sont quand même liés à IRA, à beaucoup de morts, au terreur. Mais s'ils sont coopératifs et qui ne menacent pas la démocratie, voilà, il faut coopérer. Donc, il faut stabiliser le système en invitant ceux qui veulent être constructifs et coopérer à coopérer. Et de ne pas mettre tous dans la même boîte. Et comme ça, je crois, si on fait comme ça, on peut maîtriser le problème encore. Si on met tout ensemble, ça devient très difficile, pas tellement au Parlement européen, mais spécifiquement au Conseil. Et si je peux donner un exemple sur la migration. Quand on a essayé de trouver un compromis sur la migration, la Pologne sur l'ancien gouvernement et aussi l'Hongrie sur le gouvernement actuel ont dit, nous, on ne participe pas à n'importe quel compromis. On est contre. Le gouvernement italien a dit, on travaille sur un compromis. Et ils ont fait un compromis avec l'Allemagne, la Commission, la majorité au Parlement et la majorité au Conseil. C'est ce que je veux dire. Ils ont aussi leur passé, spécifiquement le parti du Premier ministre, mais c'est ce qui compte. Et est-ce qu'on met en danger la démocratie, oui ou non? Est-ce qu'on est constructif en essayant de trouver des solutions? Et 3, ceux qui soutiennent Poutine, pour moi, ils se mettent dehors. Je regrette.
Excellent. Merci beaucoup pour ce dernier mot. Je pense que nous allons terminer cette conférence. Un immense merci de votre venue et surtout d'avoir donné en fait une vision de l'Union européenne qui est beaucoup plus complexe et en même temps beaucoup plus ouverte qu'on pourrait imaginer. Un grand merci et puis à très très vite. Hein. Voilà, bravo.